Welcome, everyone. On the behalf of Center for China Analysis and Strategy and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I would like to welcome all of you for a panel discussion on Xi Jinping, the Third New Era. And also, we are gathered here to release Mr. Jaidev Ranade's new book, China's Third New Era under Xi Jinping. So first, I would like to welcome Mr. Peter Rimmel. Mr. Peter Rimmel is currently the resident representative of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung office in India. He has a first law degree from the Freiburg University, as well as second law degree from the Ministry of Justice, Baden-Württemberg, Germany, and an MA in geography. Yesterday, we all were gathered here for his farewell party, and today we are again gathered here for Mr. Ranade's book release function. So first, I would like to welcome Mr. Peter Rimmel to say a few words and welcome all our esteemed guests.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, welcome, ni hao ma. It's a real privilege and pleasure alike to be able to address this August panel discussion on China's third new era against the backdrop of the launch of Mr. Ranade's intellectually stimulating book, for which he deserves all the accolades that he has gotten already and will get in the future too. Needless to say, I would also like to once again offer my compliments to our partner, CCAS, who has organized this distinguished panel discussion jointly with our Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's India office in Delhi. The Chinese Communist Party, founded in 1921, has not revised its historical course too often. In fact, until recently, it had done so only twice, with far-reaching ramifications and consequences not only for China, but for the world at large. The first time was in 1945, when Mao Zedong set out to overthrow the Chiang Kai-shek nationalist forces and establish the People's Republic. Second time occurred in 1981, when the country's emerging leader, Deng Xiaoping, openly denounced various policies of the Cultural Revolution and endorsed the liberalization of China's market economy. This time around, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China has set out to usher in a new era for China with its third revision of history by elevating Xi Jinping to the level of an arguably even above his famous predecessors. The new national narrative, with which Chinese children will be indoctrinated right from their childhood, will now presumably sound like this: Mao lifted China out of the humiliation from and dependency on the West. Deng Xiaoping has blazed the trail to economic prosperity, in other words, made China rich, and Xi Jinping made the Red Dragon ascend as the world's sole superpower, and henceforth anyone criticizing Xi Jinping will be tantamount to criticizing the party itself. Xi Jinping himself now has the very power to control China's past, present, and future, or to put it in the famous words of George Orwell in his science fiction novel titled 1984, we all know it: who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. What is referred to in the novel as Big Brother is watching you, we know that all. It appears alarmingly similar to surveillance systems such as Skynet at work in real life across China, enabling the CCP to monitor every single step of its citizens, hence giving Xi Jinping the technological powers and the prowess to buttress this unquenchable appetite for ever more totalitarian power. The numerous parallels that can be drawn between the novel and modern-day China convey a nagging sense that we are living through dystopian times. What the war on European soil in the Ukraine has forced my home country of Germany and the European Union to grasp, however, that it is not wise to place utopian hopes in the consciousness of authoritarian leaders, but that dystopian regimes such as China is one today can only be successfully countered by defending democratic values through concrete actions. Long gone are the times where we could simply remain prisoners of fear of an economic Chinese backlash in a situation where our intrinsic democratic values are under attack. China's third new era coincides with what the German chair of the Munich Security Conference, Mr. Ischinger, referred to as a new and dangerous era that has emerged globally, an era often of open conflict over which system should prevail, our current international system based on the values of freedom of expression, democracy, and the rule of law, or an authoritarian system where the law of military might prevails in the international arena. It has to be hereby, it is clear from a European perspective that the EU urgently needs to ask itself how it can formulate a united China policy and strategically position itself in the new great game of rivalry between the global hegemon, the USA, and Beijing. It has to be added that China's ambition for its third new era are confronted with a range of serious obstacles. While Western economies are recovering from the COVID-19 crisis, China's economy, which emerged faster than the US and Europe from the first COVID wave in 2020, is now slowing down. Beijing needs to be able to increase domestic consumption to drive growth, but it is not easy to do so at current income levels, especially in the absence of a welfare system. GDP growth is slowing, and the bursting of the real estate bubble, as the Evergrande debt crisis shows, is complicating matters. In this climate, and until domestic consumption picks up again, exports remain irreplaceable as a lever of growth, but in a context of much less favorable international relations than in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, China's third new era has only just begun, but it's already characterized by a foreign policy of assertiveness and aggressiveness, second to none. Gone is the era where China wanted to keep a low profile and bide its time. The wolves are out and they're hunting. However, being the eternal optimist that I am, I do see a light at the end of the tunnel. The state that China has become under Xi Jinping thrives on rigid discipline, and that must be constantly enforced so that normal social and institutional desires for more autonomy or freedom do not rise and challenge the dictatorial regime. The history is fraught with examples of rise and fall of totalitarian regimes, for human beings by nature are freedom-loving and resilient, but when pushed to the brink, they are likely to break the chains, so to say. And has that moment arrived yet? I'm not sure. We will find out, not so far, I believe, in the future. Thank you very much. Let me use the opportunity that I'm standing here for a few personal words. I'm sure this is not the last event I will be attending, but it is the last event I'm attending as the resident representative of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in India. For the simple reason I'm a government official seconded to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and today at midnight I reach a certain age, what leads automatically to the consequence that you are being sent to pension, and any secondment ends by that time. Now, to refer to India, if that means freedom at midnight, I would have to find out in the future. I'd like to thank for the cooperation I had all over these years in India, for the partners we met, for the good cooperation, people coming. And I close also a little bit with, call it closing a fashion circle. The tie I'm wearing today, I was wearing for the first ever event I did for CAS in Beirut, Lebanon, together with the Minister of Justice there and our president to open a rule of law program for the Middle East, or West Asia, if you want to call it, and North Africa. And I close that one today in the same way. I hope we'll have a good event, and I'm sure we do.
Thank you, Mr. Ramel, for setting the stage for today's panel discussion. But before we go into our panel discussion, I would like to invite Mr. Jaidev Ranade, who's the president of the Center for China Analysis and Strategy. He retired as Additional Secretary, Cabinet Secretariat, Government of India in 2008 and is a former member of the National Security Advisory Board. He's a member of the core group on China of the Indian Council for World Affairs, distinguished fellow of the Indian Institute for the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, and distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies. He has over 45 years of experience in analyzing developments relating to China, Tibet, and East Asia, and his foreign assignments include Hong Kong, Beijing, and Washington, D.C. And today we are here for, I think, his fourth book, and he's already released 3 books, China Unveiled, Cadres of Tibet, and Xi Jinping's China. And today the 4th book is being released. And trust me, whoever wants to study China, these books are like textbooks. So I'm, kind of advertising for all the books. They are just outside. You'll get good discounts today. So please go and buy if you want to know China. I would like to welcome Mr. Jaidev Ranade to welcome all our guests here.
Thank you, everyone. And firstly, thank you all very much for having taken the trouble to come here to join us this evening. And as a disclaimer, let me say, I did not ask Namrata to make a plug for my books. They're outside and they'll speak for themselves. Let me also say that in addition to the release of my book, we also decided to give Peter a second farewell. Peter, this is not a hint that you leave, but just a sign that, we'd like to see you around a bit more. Where China is and what happens, we will be discussing during the discussions. But the topic for the discussion is China's third new era. And whether it has begun, it has. Whether it is a third new era only for China or for the world is something we have to see. In my own view, Xi Jinping, after having taken charge in October 2012, set about changing China, the way it functions, the basic fundamentals of China. The first was done by Mao, the second by Tang, and he's the third person to do it. But in the process, he's also started putting the world on notice. And he certainly has put the United States on notice, which makes for some very interesting developments that are likely to take place, particularly with the crisis in Ukraine. But we'll discuss that, hopefully, in the course of the discussions. I just want to thank you all for coming here for the release of the book, and I do hope that you will stay on for the discussion and join us later for a drink and dinner, which is when we can have the real discussions. Thank you.
I would like to invite Mr. Pankaj Madan, Deputy Head, Conrad Adenauer Stiftung Office, Delhi, and Ms. Kalpana from KW Publishers to please join us on stage and we can, have the release of the book. It's right, the books are right in front of you. So if you could just, yeah. So now we'll start with our panel discussion. I would first introduce our chairperson for the evening, Mr. Kiran Karnik. Mr. Kiran Karnik is a former president of NASSCOM and a well-known leader and spokesperson of the IT BPO industry. Taking charge of NASSCOM in 2001, Mr. Karnik helped stabilize the organization and enabled it to continue on its path of growth, expansion, and institution building. During his tenure as president, NASSCOM, he spearheaded initiatives that helped in the following ways: reiterated NASSCOM's commitment to small and medium enterprises, providing them with a platform for interaction, learning, mentorship, and recognition. Mr. Kiran Karnik helped in the creation of Emerge, a plank especially focused on launching initiatives targeted at the smaller players within the IT BPO industry and enabled them to find a voice. And I think now I will hand over the floor to you, sir, to continue with today's proceedings.
Thank you. Excellencies, invited guests, good evening, and welcome to this panel discussion. First, congratulations, Jaydev, on the release of your book. This is one more seminal work from you, and indeed a pleasure to be here at the launch of this book. And thank you, Mr. Rimmel, for being here all these years, and your Cinderella moment will come tonight, but we wish you all the best. And welcome to fellow panelists and speakers, Indrani Bagchi. No long words of introduction required. Diplomatic editor for Times of India, and I'm sure all of you read her columns very regularly, so Indrani is well known. We have on a remote connection, which you will see, you can see up there on the screen already, we have Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary, Government of India, joining us. And we also have an expert with us, Mr. Frederick Dreher, who's a senior policy fellow from the European Council of Foreign Relations. And of course, Jaydev will lead off on the discussion. Nothing much to be said at this stage. I want to make sure that our very, very eminent panel has the time they deserve and that we have enough time for some questions and discussions in the end. So I don't want to say very much more. Mr. Rimmel has given us an excellent introduction, and Peter will talk of his book. I just want to mention that, for us, and indeed all of us, whether experts or no, and of course we are amongst the world, one of the world's foremost China experts in Ms. Jaydev Ranade, there are lots of things to be done. But for everybody else in this country, few things matter as much as China does. In fact, it's our biggest trading partner, give or take a few $1 billion, and it's a huge neighbor to the north, which we have to deal with on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis, sometimes with difficulty, sometimes otherwise. Understanding them is absolutely key. And what better way than to go to an expert who tells us about China and about the key person who is, in many ways, as we can see, the person who is the country, the party, and the chairman. As I think, Jaydev, you mentioned in one of your things, chairman of everything. And Chairman Xi Jinping is clearly leading China on a new path. I think, as Peter mentioned, the strategy of build your strength, bide your time seems to have gone. It's no longer, biding your time. Their time, they feel, is here. And the worry is for us in this country that it is at our cost. And it's a worry, may or may not be right. We have to see how to deal with it. But therefore, more than ever, an understanding of China, its leader, its leadership, its structures, and the details of where it goes is what we need to understand. And that is exactly what Jaydev has done in this book, which covers a critical period of both China's more visible, aggressive policy and also Xi Jinping's evolution into becoming ever more powerful to really take over the mantle in some sense, not so much from Deng also as much as from Mao, who he reveres in many ways, and we seem to be on the face of it, getting back to really the old style of the party being completely dominant and one person in the party dominating even the party. So with that, Jaydev, over to you to talk about your book and everything else. You want to do it from there, please do.
Thank you, Kiran. I will just pick up a few snippets in the short time that I have. 10 minutes is either too long or too short to discuss China. I mean, one can dismiss it in a word, but still. So I'll pick up on the third new era and try and sketch out what it really means, and what Xi Jinping has been doing. It started, if I could say, in October, November 2012, when Xi Jinping was appointed the party chief, which is the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee, the chairman of the Central Military Commission, which means the army chief, and the president of China. All three posts at the same time. And that was done for the first time after a gap of 30 years. Why was it done like that? It followed a period of almost 1.5 years of political turmoil in China, when another princeling, which means another son of one of the veteran communist leaders, made a bid for the top posts and wanted to oust Xi Jinping. And that was Po Xilai, the son of Po Yipo, called one of the 8 immortals as far as Chinese communist history is concerned. He lost, and Xi Jinping made it. But in the bargain, the Chinese Communist Party, they felt that the party itself had been threatened. They saw that the, shall I say, crown jewels of the party, which is the security apparatus, the army, and some of the inner central committee organizations had been penetrated by Po Xilai, which means, in other words, party controls were proven to be lax. And that shocked the party. So at the 18th Party Congress, where Xi Jinping came in, they gave him a Politburo, or a Politburo Standing Committee, which is the 7 people who really rule China, a group of people who are stolid, doctrinaire party apparatchiks, people who would follow the rule book. And they entrusted Xi Jinping with a lot of power. As I said, he got all the 3 posts at the same time. The mandate to him was very clear, that the party is losing its luster, that the party's grip is weakening, and therefore he must rectify it. And he set about it with a will. The day after taking over these posts, he convened what is called an enlarged meeting of the military commission and told them that political loyalty and reliability will be the determining criteria for promotions henceforth. The same message he conveyed to the party and to the government. So the stage was set for the party becoming, if I may say, more omnipresent than what it was. Soon thereafter, Xi Jinping spelt out his mantra, if I may call it, and he said east, west, north, south, academic, civil, military, economic and government, the party is at the center of everything. In other words, that the party's presence will be there in every organization in China, and that cell, party cell, will actually wield authority. Something that had not happened for a very long time, at least since Mao's time. But along with all this, if I may call it rectification internally, there was also a change in China's foreign policy posture. Some people were slow to realize it. I dare say the West was slower than us. We didn't pick it up also. And in April 2013, there was an intrusion carried out by the People's Liberation Army in the Depsang Plains. It was an unusual intrusion. It was long in nature. It was deeper in depth. But it happened just days before Li Keqiang was to visit India for the first time as the Chinese premier. And let me share with you a very interesting detail that I got from the then Chinese defense minister here. Chinese defense attaché here. On being probed, he confided to someone that the PLA had sent a proposal for the intrusion. The proposal had been cleared. The Politburo had discussed it. They also debated whether India would cancel Li Keqiang's visit, and the consensus was that India won't. It's too scared of China. That was the situation in April 2013. So something obviously was not right. Soon thereafter, Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, yet another expansive project and an expansionist project, which the aim of which was to span the globe. Essentially, it meant linking production centers inside China to natural resource centers and markets across the world over a China-built communications pathway. That was what the import was. And then he added to that the maritime Silk Route and the digital Silk Route, spanned it out. They set up the Western Theatre Command in order to give military support to the Belt and Road Initiative and to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which was also set up around the same time in 2015. At that time, they also had a conference on peripheral diplomacy. I think that was a very important conference because for the first time in the history of the People's Republic of China, they actually assured countries who would become friendly to them of a security umbrella. China had never done that. Not only that, it identified countries as friends and enemies. Again, for the first time in the history of the People's Republic of China, and promised the friends untold benefits in terms of largesse, in terms of diplomatic influence, in terms of military support, etc. But the point to note was that they also promised long-term, anguish is my term, but long-term periods of isolation and pressure for countries who did not subscribe to China's policies. That is what they brought in. At the 18th Party Congress, China also, or Xi Jinping also, espoused the idea of the China dream. And he spelled out it means making the Chinese people wealthy, which is good ambition, making the Chinese nation strong, and the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. And it is in the last one that there is a problem for China's neighbors, because it means actually the recovery of territories, and let me quote the Chinese, territories lost by China through the imposition of unequal treaties by hostile foreign powers. What does it mean for India? Immediately it brings up Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh, and the Andamans. All three claimed by the Chinese. For the other countries, of course, there's very much more. But after this, and I'm skipping obviously parts in order to fit the time in, at the 19th Party Congress in November 2017, Xi Jinping made another declaration, and I think that was a sign of overconfidence, where he said that they will attain the China dream by 2021, which is the 100th year of the Chinese Communist Party. They will have Made in China by 2025, which was the name given for bringing China to the level of the world's most advanced technology powers. And the third, he said, make China a major power with pioneering global influence. Now, this meant that China would have the capability of either setting up international organizations or influencing already existing international organizations. The only country that had that kind of clout was the United States. It was a direct challenge to the US. And within months, we saw the reaction. The so-called trade war between the United States and China. In my view, it was not just a trade war. It was meant to debilate the Chinese. And what Trump did was, or Trump's assistants did were, they targeted the technology sector, which is a key sector. And within a short time, the entrepreneurs in the technology sector realized that they were not that powerful and they were not that independent. That realization came to the leaders also. The first entity to be hit was ZTE, which was a leading Chinese company. It was made almost bankrupt. The second was Huawei. We are all, I think, familiar with Huawei, which almost penetrated our sector, telecom sector, in a way that had been disastrous for us. It was hit. The daughter of the founder was picked up on charges of having violated the US sanctions against Iran, and she was picked up in Canada. Then, of course, there was a long trial. Huawei, after initially saying that it doesn't bother them, they have enough capacity, they have got enough microchips, etc., in storage, they had to give up manufacturing of smartphones. They had to curtail their other activities. They were in a bad shape. In other words, the Chinese technology sector was hit, And I assess that at least for the next 5 to 7 years, it's unlikely to pick up again. That's the situation there. But meanwhile, COVID struck, the pandemic, and that came on top of an already weakening Chinese economy. Unemployment was rising, the cost of goods and living was going up, the private enterprises were shutting down because there was no business to be done. And in that time, the COVID struck. And that made matters far worse. I think almost 18 provinces had to slash budgets. The national budget, which was announced for 2 years after COVID, indicated a 20 to 25% cut in every ministry except two, the People's Liberation Army and the security apparatus. There the budgets went up. Everywhere else it went down. And that hasn't changed. In fact, this year and last year, salaries of provincial employees have been cut. Bonuses that were given have been withdrawn. So things are still not okay. And in the midst of all this, there is this pressure from the United States. China hasn't been able to get out of it. The 2 points I would like to mention here, the Chinese Institute of Contemporary International Relations, which is a think tank of their external intelligence arm, which is the Ministry of State Security, briefed the Politburo chaired by Xi Jinping and said that anti-China sentiment is at an all-time high in the world. This just when the COVID had struck, this 2021, April. And that they fear that the Western powers will utilize the dissatisfaction to stir up turmoil inside China. Lest we feel that that is only one source of information, the PLA Daily, in its editorial, which was reflective of the thinking of the armed forces, advised again that steps be taken lest the foreign powers inflame the existing dissatisfaction and create trouble inside China. So there were enough warnings there for the Chinese. The people were also unhappy at the mishandling of COVID. And there were a number of cases that took place, but surprising, I won't go into those details, but surprising were the number of articles posted at certain personal risk on social media by eminent academics who were well respected, by journalists who were picked up, of course, and punished, but they did write these tracts. And I think for the first time since the Tiananmen, they criticized the party chief by name, that is Xi Jinping, and the Chinese Communist Party, which was unusual. What they were protesting was also the surveillance systems that Xi Jinping had brought in. The facial recognition has particularly come in for criticism. The social responsibility system, which actually monitors every individual in China and determines where the individual lives, whether he can go by train, rail, or cycle, whether his children can go to a particular school or not, all that is monitored and the party decides. It's something that they are very, very apprehensive about. In other words, what Xi Jinping is doing is he's bringing in, if I may use a phrase, techno-Maoism. It's Maoism with a softer contour, but it's the same kind of thing, which is what he's doing. Let me now come to the latest situation, I think, which concerns us all, and that is the crisis in Ukraine. And I think that we need to look at a bit carefully. Putin has been cultivated, if I may use the word. Xi Jinping has invested a lot in developing a personal relationship with Vladimir Putin and between China and Russia. When Putin came to China on the 4th of February, on the sidelines of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, he had a summit meeting with Xi Jinping, and it is, in fact, almost certain from the joint statement that he briefed Xi Jinping on what his plans for Ukraine are. And if not fully briefed, at least gave him a fairly clear insight, because it talks of important strategic issues being discussed between the two, etc. Secondly, that joint statement itself was like a declaration against powers that exercise hegemony over the international world order. Who are the powers? It's obviously the United States. So there was this declaration, there was a clear underlining, if I may say, of the ideological affinity between Russia and China. And since then, what we have been seeing is the Chinese being very careful in their overt statements about the crisis in Ukraine. They have not joined the United States. In fact, they've resisted the US efforts to join with them. They have extended some kind of support to the Russians, and there are reports about them having leaked information given by the US to Russia. But at the same time, while all this is happening and China is trying to show that it is independent, there is a lot of anxiety inside China, particularly in the Chinese Communist Party, because the members of the Chinese Communist Party are worried that if the United States imposes sanctions, they'd be very badly hit. I'll conclude by just saying that almost 70% of the director level officers at counties and above in China send their children to the United States for studies, or their relatives' children. And the total count done by the Chinese Communist Party members is that 300 million people will be affected if these sanctions are imposed. And I'm only talking about the kids going to the United States. There are a whole lot more. A lot of them have their money secreted in the United States. Their businesses are going to be affected. So personally, I think China is in for a difficult time. We'll have to wait and see what happens. And it is at this time that the behavior of Xi Jinping becomes critical. And I will end on the note just by saying that Xi Jinping and Putin are both creatures of their respective communist parties. They have been molded deep within the Communist Party. They both have global ambitions, and at this point in time, I think their neighbors certainly have to be very careful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaydev, for that very fascinating account of the recent concerns and where we are. I know I'd love to hear more from you, but more in the discussion. I want to move on to our next speaker in the panel, Mr. Frederick Graer. I mentioned briefly, he's from the European Council, and I'm sure he's going to give us a view both from Europe and much broader than that. Over to you,
Mr. Chairman, let me say that I'm deeply honored and a bit intimidated, to be honest, to be part of such an amazing gathering of experts on the occasion, the launch of the book of Mr. Ranade, Xi Jinping, China's Third New Era. I'm by no means a China expert, but I've been for a long time, like many of you, I guess, an admirer of his work. And I read his analyses in whatever form they are published, whenever I can and whenever I receive them. For the sake of argument, what I'd like to say today is that the third new era that the book is talking about may not be over, but that in a way, we may be starting the fourth new era. And let me define that. What the book described is the period which led to the current situation. A period of consolidation of Xi's power, of reorganization of the PLA, and reassertion of the CCP control over every aspect of Chinese life. In other words, as described earlier, a period of speedy return to totalitarianism. By fourth new era, I just mean, and this is just a figure of style, that the era of relatively easy, although truly impressive modernization and outside projection may be over. In other words, the world is starting to react seriously to China. I speak here as a European, and I can witness that the perception of China in Europe has drastically changed, over the past few years. China is no longer seen today only as a huge potential economic opportunity and distant threat. It is still seen in some quarters as a huge economic opportunity, and indeed it is. But this perception is considerably mitigated by a sense that it is also a threat that is both multinational and actually not that distant. It is multidimensional because most people, if not everybody in Europe today, now understands better the risk inherent to the sort of blind cooperation with China that has prevailed for years. I'm talking, of course, of the consequences of the sort of technology transfer that have occurred to the benefit of China, either through investment or perhaps less acceptable means, which has led in Europe to questioning of this so-called win-win process, but also the deeper understanding that European complacency might actually work in favor of the CCP and be exploited directly against European interests. It is multidimensional also because we clearly see that over the past few years, China has weaponized every single activity that it has been involved in, including the most basic ones for geopolitical gain. It is multidimensional still because China also distorts even multilateralism and the world order or disorder, but which has benefited all of us in order to make it suit its own interest. You may ask, of course, how different this is from the past or current practices of other states, but this then sends us back to the very fundamental of international relations, which is about conflict of interest, and the conflict of interest is increasingly obvious. In this context, I would like to consider two recent phenomena which have and are influencing European perception of China. The first one, of course, is the COVID crisis. The second is Ukraine. The COVID crisis was the first time that China had figured so prominently on an issue of such immediately critical importance to European citizens and government. As such, China did become a conspicuous part of policy debates around COVID-19 in Europe. More importantly, it did put pressure on EU officials during the crisis to soften their criticism of China, attack European countries, starting with mine, France, for their response to the crisis and spreading false accusation all over. This episode will definitely have an impact on Europe-China relationship long after the crisis subsides. There already are reactions, and if they are not always very readable and even less spectacular, they indicate nonetheless a new mindset vis-à-vis Beijing, which did not exist before Xi Jinping and which are very direct outcome of the consolidation of its own power. Countries are living the 17+1. An Indo-Pacific strategy has been made public, as well as several more technical instruments, such as the investment screening mechanism, while alternatives to the dependency on China are being searched, etc., etc. Interestingly, too, agreements signed by the Commission but seen as too favorable to Beijing, such as the investment mechanism known as SKY, are unlikely to be ratified by the European Parliament, which also indicate a new popular mindset in Europe vis-à-vis China. But Ukraine more recently certainly marked a new step in this whole process. The position taken by Beijing on Ukraine is unlikely to improve the relationship with Europe. To be clear, China didn't want to see the war happening, but ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it keeps stressing that Moscow's security concerns should be respected, and when they were not even threatened, insists that sanctions should be abandoned and keeps trying to divide European and Americans over the issue. But the war in Ukraine also demonstrated the limit and constraints that Xi Jinping China is now encountering. As the French sinologist François Godemont recently wrote, for a long time, China may have thought it could enjoy the benefits of commercial and financial interdependence while challenging the liberal world order and Asia-Pacific security. Indeed, in Ukraine, China initially supported Russia's aggressiveness, thinking it could reap the benefits without sharing the risk. Today, however, China finds itself embroiled in a situation that could actually harm its own interest. The unprecedented sanctions that have been put in place by Europe and the US may actually seriously affect both China's economic interests through indirect or secondary sanction, as well as its own irredentist claims. So China's third new era that Mr. Ranada's book speaks about is the one that has triggered the present one, in which a disinhibited China is increasingly trying to divide and marginalize Europe, but which isn't likely to facilitate its own interest. Indeed, China has already wasted the political capital and goodwill it has patiently and adroitly, I must say, accumulated until the ascent of Xi Jinping. All this doesn't mean, of course, that China's rise is over and that we are collectively going back to the status quo ante. The war in Ukraine, just to mention this, is far from over, and how things will ultimately turn is still to be seen. But what is certain is that China will now have to face much more serious challenges, which may threaten also its own domestic economic progress. And from that perspective, a parallel could be established between the situation in China and the situation in Europe, for example. And the two may eventually influence each other. So at the end of the day, we are facing a situation which is uncertain, not just for us, but everybody. China is partly responsible for it, although it's not the sole responsible. Whether this will ultimately reinforce the authoritarian tendencies observed under Xi Jinping or the contrary weaken them remains to be seen, but the question at least and at last is now raised. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mr. Grar. I do hope you can stay on with us and join the discussion, which we'll have shortly. I'm holding questions to the end because I'd like everybody who's listening in, joining in here, to listen to all the speakers before we get to questions, but please do stay on. Our next speaker is going to be Ms. Indrani Bagchi. I mentioned earlier the persona Indrani, which is most familiar to all of us, which is your role as the diplomatic editor of the Times of India. I understand that I can now say that you're CEO of Anant Aspen India, so let me introduce her as the CEO of Ananta Aspen Center in India. Over to you, Indrani.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Karnik. It does feel a little strange to be no longer described as a journalist, but I think I will always remain one at heart. So thank you, Mr. Ranade, for inviting me. And as usual, your book is a treasure trove because I have read all the others, but mostly I've read all the articles when they were written. I am not the China expert here. Between Mr. Ranade and Mr. Gokhale, there's a wealth of China expertise here, not to speak of Mr. Suri, who will kill me if I say anything wrong. And but I just wanted to focus on Xi Jinping and what the last few years of the Xi Jinping era have meant for India-China relations. I think while we were all surprised, at least most people were surprised when the Ladakh and Eastern Ladakh incursions happened in April 2020. I think in some ways, we are also responsible for lulling ourselves into believing that China might be A, a responsible power, B, would make space for India as the other rising power. I don't think that may have been in somebody's conscience in Beijing many, many years ago. It hasn't been in evidence for some time now. Of course, I put the tipping point, frankly, at 2008, which was not really because of the Beijing Olympics, but it was the time when India got a nuclear waiver from the NSG. And I say this from personal experience a little bit because I was sitting in the pavement outside the NSG building in Vienna those 3 days in September, on September 8, waiting for this waiver to go through. And we could see when the Chinese walked out of the building in the middle of the night, and they were brought back about an hour later. That moment remains in my head, because to me that was a point when I think China realized what a mistake it was to actually allow the entire nuclear deal to go through. And I think from then on, it has been downhill. By 2010, we were watching China putting staple visas on our people, our citizens from both Jammu and Kashmir and Arunachal. But from 2013, we have had a series, I think Mr. Ranade referred to them, but from 2013, we have had a series of not just incursions, but when we used to report on those incursions, we used to be told that in Durban, which was the first time Xi Jinping met our Prime Minister, that a new path was going to be set for India-China relations, a path that would be more accommodating, a path that would be more recognizing of India's own rise. I don't think in the past decade we have seen that pan out. From the fact that China disregarded the ruling, the PCA ruling on the South China Sea, to its repeated efforts to keep, and successful efforts to keep India out of the nuclear suppliers group, to keep a hold on sanctioning of terrorists, which normally China would not, should not do in the UN Security Council, to a number of other related activities, from CPEC to the BRI. We have seen from 2013 was the Depsang crisis, 2014 we saw crisis in Chumar, and 2017 we saw Doklam. If you watched the Chinese foreign minister's visit here last week, it was almost a reprise of Doklam, when again it was yet another BRICS summit that happened in Xiamen, which spurred another party congress, which spurred an understanding and a withdrawal from the face-off point. And that was in 2017. After that, we have had two informal summits where if you went past the atmospherics, nothing really happened. Meanwhile, the world was changing, and you can see that foreign policy was also becoming very different. It was becoming more technology-oriented. It was becoming more trust-oriented. And obviously, we could not go anywhere with China on that. It took, in a sense, it took, before Galwan, before the incursions in May, which were discovered on the 5th, 6th, and the 9th of May in eastern Ladakh and Arunachal, I would say the red flag went up in April, when the Chinese central bank took a 1% stake in HDFC Bank. That was a time which set off alarm bells in government. We reported, and this was just weeks before it brought the first announcements from the Indian government of putting curbs on investments from countries with borders. And it was only one country, of course, targeted at only one country. But that was just weeks before the incursions were discovered in eastern Ladakh and Arunachal. What happened afterwards, of course, is too recent for me to recount at this point. I would say that 2 years, 2.5 years down the line, with the pandemic still not gone, we can make we can come to several sort of conclusions about China as it is today under Xi Jinping. First, its aggression, its expansionism will not go away. It doesn't matter whether you have understandings on Gogra or hot springs or sorry, sorry, that is, it doesn't matter whether you have such understandings. The point is that that's going to stay, because whatever disengagement we do, we will, the de-escalation will be a long, long while away because of the almost semi-permanent infrastructure that has already been created. So China has created new realities on the ground, which no matter how many times you have an agreement, is not going to go away. For everybody who believes that it is either a continental issue or a maritime issue, it's both, and it will remain both. Xi Jinping, the China under Xi Jinping has no place for accommodating India. And all you had to do was to look at the Chinese Foreign Ministry statement that came out after Wang Yi's visit here last week. The tone deafness was astounding. So if you were thinking that, yes, there are people in Beijing who are actually thinking, who lost India and why did we lose India? I don't think anybody's thinking that, at least not if you believe this official statement by the Chinese Foreign Ministry. Because there was Wang Yi saying that, oh yeah, you know what, let's just go back to doing what we were doing, let's go back to trading, let's go back to a normalized relationship, and just let's forget about the border. Let's keep the border in an appropriate place. This is old language. This is language that has been thrown at India for years. And keeping that in the appropriate place after 2.5 years of Indian government statements at the very highest levels, saying very clearly that the relationship cannot go back until the border is stabilized. What does that tell you? It tells you a lot about what the kind of power that China sees itself and what it sees India as. So I actually don't think that we are going to get anywhere anytime soon. My time is up, so I'm going to stop here and talk this later.
Thank you, Indrani, and thank you for staying on. I know you had to leave early, and I think that was your alarm, so time for you to go. But thank you. And we'll miss you at the discussion.
Thank you.
But we will keep in mind your comments and discuss those. I want to move to the last speaker on our panel, Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary and expert, and obviously someone who knows this from the inside and from the outside. So over to you, Ambassador Gokhale.
Thank you, Dr. Karnik. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I know that we are running a little short of time, so I'll keep my remarks very brief. All the previous speakers have talked about a rising China. From my perspective, India faces a fundamentally different situation today from what she has faced in the past 75 years, because we have a superpower on our doorstep now. And as China looms larger in the world stage, it will impact all areas from politics and security to business and innovation in India. And therefore, I wholeheartedly endorse Dr. Karnik's initial comments that a careful study of China, every aspect of it, is no longer a question of choice. It has to become a mandatory set of courses at the university level across disciplines, sciences, humanities, and business studies. To my mind, what is most unfortunate is that the available material is written largely from the Western perspective. And for India to make diplomatic, military, or business decisions based on information which comes out of the West is, to my mind, a fundamentally untenable proposition. India's perspective is absolutely necessary, and this is an area where we have paucity of good scholarship. And therefore, in this situation, I can think of no person better suited to write about contemporary China than Jaydev Ranade, who is easily one of the most knowledgeable subject matter specialists that I have come across in my career. I won't dwell at great length on this third new era of Xi Jinping because both Jaydev and Frederick Grah have spoken about it. What I do want to say is that a central authoritarian figure is back at the center of everything in China, and this has led to a shifting of both domestic and foreign policies. One point I do want to flag in Jaydev's new book is the areas that he has focused on beyond the obvious areas of domestic and foreign policy. For instance, he has a chapter on the information on how China has developed its path to high technology. This is something we have to learn from. There are too many Indians who still believe that China is simply a copycat, whereas in fact in many technologies, China is neck to neck with and probably ahead of the United States. Jaydev has another interesting chapter on how China uses propaganda as a tool of foreign policy. We can see this in front of our eyes. The United Front work that is being done in the Tibetan community in India and in the Buddhist community. The way the International Department of the Communist Party, operating from inside the Chinese embassy, is able to penetrate into the political structures of India. The way in which the State Council Information Office places 5 and 10-page supplements in our major newspapers. And yet we don't realize what is happening under our nose, the influence operations that are being mounted under our very noses. And these are small nuggets of very valuable information that Jaydev has highlighted. But the most important point that Jaydev has spoken about is the vulnerabilities and gaps in Xi Jinping's power, despite his overwhelming dominance in China today. I was reading an essay by Yuan Ang. She is an American scholar who has written an amazing book on China's political economy called The Gilded Age, The Paradox of Economic Boom and Vast Corruption. It's a brilliant book, came out last year. She wrote an essay in which she makes this very point that runs through Jaydev's whole book. So the pressing questions of the day that we need to ask ourselves are, is the handling of COVID by the Chinese, is the way in which they have allowed China-US tensions to grow, is this new strategic partnership between China and Russia as encapsulated in the joint statement of the 4th of February, is the war that has been launched on big business, are the acts along the line of actual control by design, or is this hubris? And if it is the latter case, does everybody in China go along with President Xi, or are there concerns over his leadership? The absence of overt challenges to Xi's authority need not imply, at least to my mind, that there is no opposition within China. And it seems to be counterintuitive that when someone tightens the grip, to me, it doesn't suggest that he is in absolute control. Indeed, it suggests the very opposite. And we need look no further on this than our own history. A Prime Minister of India with a 350-seat majority in Parliament declared emergency in 1975 when she was at the height of her power. And eventually that emergency led to the fall of her government 2 years later. So my point is that the party congress that is going to come up might rubber stamp Xi Jinping for a third term. But I think we need to look beyond this superficial analysis of what is happening in China and from an Indian perspective go much deeper into it. And these are issues that Jaidev has covered in his book. So I'll conclude with one observation, and that is that whatever happens in the party congress, to me this much is clear. One, we urgently need Indians to write good books and pieces on China. Two, we must introduce China-related studies in all university curriculums. Three, we need to build public opinion rationally, but without demagoguery or hyperbole, by making debate over China informed and educative. Four, we need to recognize that China has made substantial achievements as well and learn from them, especially on the economic and technological fronts. We cannot trash China entirely merely because we have differences with them. Five, we need to very carefully reflect on what the Chinese foreign minister said in New Delhi last week, when he said that China is not seeking a unipolar Asia and about respecting India's traditional role in the region, to see whether their actions, their deeds match their words. No longer should we take their words at face value. And lastly, we need to recognize that this larger than life projection of China, which we all think about in India, is basically a domestic Chinese requirement. And we need to grapple with a much more sophisticated, much more nuanced understanding about the internal dynamics of China. And in all these respects, I don't think that Jaidev Ranade's book will disappoint the reader. Thank you, Dr. Karnik, for giving me the time.
Thank you, Ambassador Gokhale, and thank you particularly for that summing up of key points, which I think are so critical. I know we've run out of the originally planned time, not quite, but there, but I think we can, in all fairness, agree to spend a little more time for some questions and maybe very brief comments. I would prefer questions, please, because we don't have too much time. But if there's a brief comment, please go ahead. And our panelists, Indrani had to go, but the others are here. I understand both Mr. Grar and Ambassador Gokhale are online, and of course, Jaidev is right here. So, questions?
Good evening, sir. I introduce myself as General Rajiv, being a China watcher. I have a few questions to throw at Mr. Frederick. There is a point which I would like Dr. Ranade to cover, and also Ambassador Gokhale. For Frederick, I have 5 points. He has spoken a lot about Europe and the West understanding China. But well, if he can answer me, when are they going to remove their global supply chains from China? It's not been done. So saying means nothing. Last I read about, there are more than 52 cases against China in the WTO. China was brought into the WTO in a hurry. They don't follow any international norms. They never did in 2001. They still don't do it. Why is it still in WTO? That's number 2. Number 3 is, why is renminbi, which is just a name, as SDR, why is the US and the West still permitting that? Why isn't yuan in the SDR in IMF? Why is it renminbi, which is, I've never seen a monetized renminbi. If anybody has seen it, please let me know. And when will the US and the West take back the more than 70% of the international maritime routes where China has controlling stakes? When you do that, then I will understand that you consider China as a threat. If you're not doing it, then you're working with China through that. So that was that for him. For Dr. Ranade was just one point. As a military man, within this barely 2 years since the Ladakh incident, we have a 4th Western theater commander in China. So what does that reflect? Within this, it's not even 2 years, there is a 4th Western theater commander who has been nominated in China, in place. So that's a major statement which comes there. And for Ambassador Gokhale, just to comment, like you said, we need to be very careful about what Wang Yi mentioned about not a unipolar Asia. I never believed the Chinese, never have. But we understand that in the near to medium term is going to face a lot of challenges. So is he looking at, in the near to medium term, India looking at the Indian Ocean region, and he looks at the concentrates on the Western Pacific, becomes strong, and then comes into the Indian Ocean. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we should take at least one or maybe two more questions before we get to the answers so that we can put together any common points. Oh, okay, Mr. Grar, you want to respond right away? Please go ahead.
No, it's not that I want to respond right away, but I mean, I need to go afterwards. If I understand our questioner correctly, he's asking why we haven't changed the world suddenly because we realized that China was a problem. Yes, we have been slow perhaps in realizing it was a problem, but we have indeed realized it was a problem. Now, when it comes to the real world, things are slightly more complicated to achieve. There is a process by which you achieve things. And as far as I remember, even India, which has decided a summer ago to decouple from China, hasn't been able to do so as satisfactory as it would have liked to. And this is not a critique back to the critics that was just expressed. That's the nature of things because things are complicated and we live in an interconnected world that we have to really take in consideration. As simple as that or as complicated as that. So yes, this decoupling on our part is not complete, but yes, at the same time, there is growing reactions to whatever China is. And as I said in my introduction, those changes may not be spectacular, they may not be as radical as some of you may wish, perhaps. But again, there is a real world out there, and this is the one that we have to take in consideration when we deal with those complicated issues.
Thank you. Fair comment. Jaidev, do you want to hold on or comment now? Go ahead. No, go ahead.
To respond to your question, about the fourth military commander, the first person was a medical casualty. But before they appointed him, his sort of record of service indicated that he had been specifically chosen to head Western Theatre Command. But he fell ill and then he died a month later. His successor was again a person who was there for a very short time, a temporary sort of appointment. But the third person was an officer reputed to really train and toughen the troops. And he did that. He was there for a while. He inspected virtually every unit in Western Theatre Command, which, as you know, is quite a task. But the fourth person, who is now there as the commander of the Western Theatre Command, is a person who has spent virtually his entire career in Tibet, in Xinjiang, and a person who knows the terrain. He has served in Ali AD, by the way, Ali MSD, and he's the person I think we do need to watch out for. He's in charge right now of the Western Theatre Command. So to answer your question, there was a bungling. Maybe their medical examination facilities were not that good, but certainly the selection done now is deliberate, and it's a very competent person. I don't know how effective he'll be in real time, but that's his record. Thank you.
Worries me when you say competent, but worries me when you say competent general there, but that's okay. Vijay, do you want to respond?
Dr. Karnik, I couldn't get the gist of the question.
Do you want to repeat your comment? It was a comment more than a question, but in fairness, if you just repeat the comment, I think.
The point was that Wang Yi, like you mentioned, had mentioned that they are not looking at a unipolar Asia. So are they considering their issues that they are facing, economic especially, and the way the world has shifted due to the Ukraine conflict? is he in the interim wanting India to look after the Indian Ocean region while he strengthens himself in the Western Pacific before he steps into the Indian Ocean region? And one immediate input that is coming up is when you look at what has happened in Sri Lanka.
I don't think it was Wang Yi's intention when he said that to suggest that India and China should divide up the region. I think this is a typical holding pattern that the Chinese engage in when they need to repair some of the damage with us by providing some kind of assurance that they regard as a major regional power. Their strategic view is quite clear and has always been so, that China is the dominant Asian power and that there is no equal. But from time to time, they have suggested some sort of a role for India. And I think this is what he was hinting at the moment. I think this is a statement which we should not take at face value, but in fact, we should question. Because if you look at it, he did three things before he actually said this. He made a very explicit statement in Beijing on the 7th of March, in which he said that Quad is part of the American alliance system. So he's placed two with the Americans. He goes to Pakistan and he talks about Kashmir, knowing the sensitivity we have. And then he decides on a conference in Afghanistan, where you are the only near neighbor, which is kept out. So that's why my point was, let's look at their actions and not their words.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. Yes, back there, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm Praful, I'm editor of Organizer. I have a question for Ambassador Gokhale first. Sir, I would like to have your comment on Chinese reactions and our diplomatic efforts post 370. Simply because first time India politically claimed the boundaries in terms of districts, and I know you have been a very diplomatically very closely associated with the process. So do you see any correlation between Chinese aggression and the way we have claimed or rather reclaimed Aksai Chin and the Pak-occupied Jammu Kashmir on our maps? And sir, in continuation with the question that General asked, I would like to specifically know, because there have been various talks about the relationship between Communist Party's core committee and PLA. And there were talks about, whether Xinjiang group has been resurrecting and Xi Jinping. So how do you see the capability of PLA and the effectiveness and control of Xi Jinping over the military affairs? Thank you.
Vijay, you want to answer right away? At least the first one. If you want the second one, you can pass on to Jaidev.
Yeah, sure. I see no correlation whatsoever between government's decision to repeal Article 370 of the Constitution and Chinese action on the LAC in 2020, although the Chinese find this a good pretext. And let me give you three very clear reasons why I say so. Number one, we did not change any of our international boundaries as a result of the repeal of Article 370. Therefore, there is no question of the Article 370's repealing having any impact on the India-China boundary question. Second, we should recall that this is not the first time that India has changed its internal arrangements in a region bordering China. In the year 2000, we created the new state of Uttarakhand from the erstwhile state of Uttar Pradesh. Now, the state of Uttarakhand also has territories that China considers to be in dispute. Did they protest on that occasion? I don't think they did, because I was in the ministry handling China at that time. Therefore, it makes no sense to suggest that our changing the internal borders of the state caused offense. And thirdly, let's ask ourselves, who changed the status quo between 1947 and 2019? India stuck faithfully to Article 370 of the Constitution. It is Pakistan which consistently changed the status quo. and the Chinese helped them in that. The Sino-Pakistan boundary changed the status quo. The building of the Karakoram highway changed the status quo. The Chinese activities in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir changed the status quo. Therefore, let me just say, we must forcefully as a country reject the Chinese propaganda in this regard. There is no connection whatsoever that can be drawn between government's decision to repeal Article 370 and the Chinese aggression of 2020.
Jaidev, you want to take the second one?
I've read the reports about so-called a clique in Xinjiang, etc. They're absolutely untenable. They're not. There's no evidence to back them. As far as Xi Jinping's grip on the PLA is concerned, let me very briefly mention 2-3 things. Firstly, every serving general in the PLA today is a Xi Jinping appointee. Every single one. Second, Xi Jinping has dismissed over 180 officers of the rank of Major General and above in the PLA. Let me assure you that in any bureaucracy, there are enough others here who can contradict me, in any bureaucracy, when you find that happening in your department, you're going to toe the line. And that's exactly what's happening in China. The PLA is in the grip of the Chinese Communist Party. Thirdly, there are rectification campaigns in the PLA that are going on every year to weed out people with suspect political loyalties, which means any person who's not in line. They can be charged with corruption or with political wavering, as they say, and they're removed. So as far as the Chinese Communist Party is concerned, their grip is, I would say, near total. Some of the youngsters who are joining, the graduates, naturally they're not amenable to the kind of discipline that the older guard are. That is being sorted out in its own way. And finally, Xi Jinping has directed the party apparatus to expand the number of CCP cells and CYL cells, that is the Communist Youth League cells, in the PLA. So I would not look forward to any sort of, shall I say, indiscipline of a large scale in the PLA. No chance. Second, the competence of the PLA, as you said, I don't know how competent they'll be when they really face us. And I'm not talking about with sticks and stones. I'm talking about in a real conflict. When it comes to that, we will see. But there are 2 points here I'd like to make. One, from what I'm reading in the Chinese media, the PLA personnel are not entirely happy about staying in high altitudes for a long time. So the PLA military commission has increased the allowances being given to soldiers, including Tibetans, at high altitudes. The latest figures I have, if you're interested, I can give them to you. Second, that they're doing a lot of training, but again, as I said, they're also getting a lot of benefits. So, tents and warm clothes, etc., are being supplied, hot food is being sent to them, but they don't want to stay more than a few months at a time. And that is a problem. So the PLA has started trying to increase the recruitment from Mongolia, from Xinjiang, and from Qinghai in order to give relief to the Hans who are otherwise posted there. So the rest of the question you'll have to ask the army person as to how competent they are.
Yeah, okay. Can't refrain from making one passing comment before we move on to more questions, Jaidev. I know you're very careful with your words and you studied it. So when you talk of a confrontation beyond sticks and stones, and you say when it comes to that, I get very worried. You don't use if, you use when, but noted. I know you foresaw what happened now back in 2016, so that worries me even more, your ability to forecast correctly. I know there are a lot of questions, but we'll take only 2 more with your indulgence. All the others, Jaidev is here, the other 2 will not be here because they're not here physically, and Indrani had to go. But at drinks and dinner, please buttonhole them. But meantime, the lady back there, please. Yeah, I can see that.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Riya Sinha. I'm a researcher with the ORF. Let me begin by saying it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to be among such esteemed panelists today. I have 2 questions, and they're based off Mr. Rana Day and Ambassador Vijay Gokhale's comment. In terms of the larger geopolitical environment that we're facing today, especially with the presence of the Chinese footprint in South Asia, and as well as the fact that we have a superpower on our border, and that's something new to us. And it's almost as if they're very indifferent to anything we say or we try to do, as has been made clear by the comments here today. My question is, how exactly can India tread its way here? Like, how can it really make its presence felt, especially in its own neighborhood? And my second question is on the AFPAC region. And as we know, India has had extensive presence in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades, but now we see that we have sort of retreated from that, and we see a heavier Chinese presence vis-a-vis Pakistan. The latest development was that we sent food aid to Afghanistan, so that was the first most active sort of engagement we've had with the current regime there. So I would like to ask the panelists, how do you think we can go about this, and how can we show a better presence there and counter the Chinese presence? Do they think that maybe possibly sending an Indian envoy on ground to Afghanistan to at least overlook the distribution of the food aid and also reach out to former government employees and former allies is a good idea, especially in light of the increasing Chinese presence there. And so not to mention that it is our backyard after all, and we do have two of our adversaries who are very much present there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Vijay, do you want to go first?
No.
No, please. No, go ahead. I want you to go first.
No, Jaideep can take that question.
He insists.
Well, let me deal with one part of your question. The second part about Afghanistan, I don't know. I mean, we are talking about sending in food aid, etc. That's one part of it. But when you talk about us being, I mean, the way you painted it is as if we are almost helpless. I don't think so. I think there are two reasons why I would say that. One, look at what the Chinese are doing and how they're behaving with us. Why should they make such an investment of time and energy and duplicity if we are a non-entity? When Wang Yi came here this time, there are two things that you should note. One, he did not want it to be announced that he's going to come to India. Why? Something that troubled me, and I hope it raised eyebrows in our north and south blocks. It was a very strange request to make. Firstly, they initiate a visit, and then they request us not to announce it. There are only two reasons that come to my mind. One, to sow the seeds of suspicion in the US and the West about the possibility of China colluding with us on Ukraine to drive a wedge. Second, to sow dissension within India, as if the Chinese and us are concluding some kind of a deal, setting aside the border issue. And I'm not talking in the air here. You would be aware that there were at least 2 TV channels that carried those headlines saying, Wang Yi's visit, a thaw, question mark. There were articles that appeared in Kwancha, which is a Chinese portal, and they were picked up by Nikkei Asia and another paper, talking about the possibility of cooperation between India and China on trade, consequent to Wang Yi's visit. And a third, an article in the Hindu, which again spoke about certain things in the offing. Now, these are, to my mind, put out by the Chinese to try and create an atmosphere. But as far as we were concerned, our response was very clear. And again here, we had the External Affairs Minister, not the Foreign Secretary, which is usually the case, External Affairs Minister coming and setting the record straight. So I think, we are not really non-entities. We may not be, muscling our way around as the Chinese are. But then the Chinese are losing friends and we are trying to make friends. We are making friends. So I'm not trying to give you a government line here, but this is my personal belief. I also feel that if you look at Sri Lanka, we have gained a lot of ground, visibly. If you look at Maldives, we have again gained ground there. Something must have been done. I don't know what it is. I can guess, but I'm not going to guess at this forum. But obviously things have been done. There are people here who probably are more aware. I won't name them, but Nepal also, there is something happening there. The Chinese are worried. Wang Yi went there for that reason. So I won't suggest that, everything is over. But this I will concede, that we cannot match the Chinese dollar for dollar. But the dollar is not the only thing here. There are many other instruments that can be used.
Thank you. Vijay?
I just want to add to that by saying that I think we should also look at whether there is a backyard that any other country has. Because in the globalized world, nobody has a backyard. In the Americas, the dominant part of the United States is being challenged by China and Russia. In Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which were the Russian backyard, you have NATO and Europe. In the Pacific, which was an Australian backyard, you have the Chinese. In the South China Sea, which was a Chinese backyard, you have everybody else. Therefore, I don't think we are in any unique situation. We are in a situation where, in a globalized world, there are no exclusive backyards, there are only shared spaces. And it is therefore a question of how we secure our strategic interests in those shared spaces. And I think Jaidev was basically hinting at the fact that we are able to do so. And it doesn't have to be by dollar diplomacy or by muscle diplomacy. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. The last question, please. Yes. Vijay won't hear you otherwise if you don't use the mic.
My name is Vineet Goenka. I'm Secretary of Center for Knowledge Sovereignty. This question is for Mr. Ranade. Well, we have discussed this many times. So while today's evening, I have been hearing about kinetic warfare and the ingress which has been made on the borders. I also see ingress been done in the fintech platforms, the investments in the fintech platform, which cursorily somebody mentioned about it. But we have not touched upon the ingress been made in the e-sports arena, where our kids have been influenced. And this is going to be big ingress because the pain here doubles when the investment comes from West, not from the China directly, whereas the investment originates from China. So is this something which we should talk about? Is China planning about some data colonization here, whereby influencing the kids who are below 12 years old? And have we given a thought about the non-kinetic engagement which will happen in 2030 between us and the North?
Thank you. Jaidev?
Well, that question has been posed to a person who's already converted to that point of view. I've been raising Huawei for many years, the issue about Huawei entering India and the threat that it poses. It's finally been sort of put in its place. But the threat is not only from the Chinese, as you rightly pointed out, from everywhere. We have to strengthen our own systems. It can be done, we have to make the investment. But the moment you allow a foreign company to come in, you are to that extent making yourself vulnerable. And I will just make one comment before concluding. When we talk of cyberspace, you need a policy which is end-to-end. That is what the Chinese did. We didn't have a policy as such. We decided that we'll computerize. We began importing parts and assembling them here. But we did not focus on hardware. We did not focus on software. Software happened. Hardware we have neglected. Until you have hardware, you cannot be self-sufficient in the cyberspace and you cannot be secure. So as far as data is concerned, it is the same thing. And let me mention to you one thing, that the Chinese are focused on data. They're focused on data because they're focused on AI. They're working on AI. The more the data that comes in, the stronger the AI. So that is the correlation there. And I think we have a way to go still on this field.
I said last question, but we will take one more because I was right blinded. So in all fairness, I know you hand up earlier, so please go ahead.
My name is Vijay Kranti. My limitations of knowledge and wisdom is only limited to Tibet for last few years. When we see how the world is looking at China or how the world wants to confront China, I am quite shocked to see various experts and various institutions only limiting themselves to watching China from inside and hoping something will happen inside. You know, the Communist Party will have some frictions inside, or PLA will be unhappy, something, or Democrats will do something and something will happen in China, China will break, and then we'll be a happy world. But we don't see a solid action from all those countries who are suffering individually and collectively. So may I request Mr. Friedrich, maybe he is the right man to answer, why we don't see a real action which can happen. And I think Ukraine has provided perhaps one opportunity, maybe it may be the last opportunity, the world can really confront China in a decisive manner.
Thank you. I think he's left, but if I might just say, not so much on his behalf, but just to recall that he answered that question in a way saying, we're doing things, but it's the real world. But I'm sorry he's not there. Jaydev, do you want to make a comment on it, or? No. Okay, so, Siddharth? Yeah. Really last question. I'm sorry everybody else. And I'm allowing Siddharth because he's an old friend and an old colleague, not in age, but otherwise. And then, okay, in fairness, we'll end with the lady. So.
I just wanted to ask a very provocative question, as you might suggest. What's the big deal of allowing China to be number one instead of the United States? It's no worse.
I think that needs a response. Siddharth, I have known you for some years, including in not close quarters, but closed quarters. You're extremely provocative, as is this question. So let me respond in a similar fashion. If the Chinese actually become number one, what will happen is that they will introduce, and I'm using a polite word here, the community of common destiny, their concept, which means we will all think the way they want us to think, and we will all behave the way they want us to behave. With America as number one, we may not like them, but we are still free enough to do what we like. That is going to be the difference.
I know Siddharth's response, but I'll let him respond separately on that one. We must end with the lady, and we will end with the lady. So absolutely the last question. I'm sorry everybody else, but really last one.
Hi, this is Chandrakala from ETV Network. My question is for Ambassador Gokhale. We have seen that in last couple of days when we the Ukraine crisis, India has somehow maintained a neutral approach when it's, when it comes to its stand on the entire crisis. Do you think this is a way forward, or India should come up with a more bolder stance when it comes to such, crisis, given the fact that we have seen Chinese aggressiveness growing day by day? Do you think there should be a change when it comes to India's foreign policy? It is high time for a change in India's foreign policy. Your take on that. And also my second question is, we have seen a flurry of visit by foreign ministers from different countries visiting New Delhi. What would be your take? How do you see this developments? Thanks.
Vijay?
It's not my place to comment on the appropriateness of government policy. What I do want to say, however, that our position on Ukraine has been consistent with our foreign policy principles. The government has clearly criticized the worsening situation and called for an end to conflict. The government has said that the only way forward is through dialogue. And the government has talked of maintaining the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all parties, and that includes the Ukraine. So as far as I can see it, government's position is entirely consistent with national interest, with the international law, and with the UN Charter. Now, this may not be to the liking of some people in the West, but I'm afraid it's just too bad. We are 1.5 billion people, and we have a right to our own opinion and to act in our national interest. If others don't like it, well, they just adjust to it. As far as the foreign ministers and other leaders coming to India is concerned, I think this is a phenomenon we have seen over the last 10 to 12 years. It is a reflection of the size of our economy, of the growth of our influence, of the talent of our population. And I don't think that it is anything unusual that is happening at this point of time.
Thank you. Before I sort of formally close off the panel, 2 sentences to wind up. Anything, Vijay, which you want to add before we wind up? Nothing?
No.
Thank you. Jaidev? No? Nothing? Okay, let me just take literally 2 minutes, not to sum up, as summing up such a extensive and excellent panel discussion would be impossible and outside my abilities certainly. Just want to pick up a few points which have stuck in my head and add my 2 bits maybe to them, so I'm sure that I'm not wrongly paraphrasing what someone said. But fairly randomly, a couple of things. One is the question, and this starts with what Mr. Rimmel mentioned in some way. Is China caught in the middle income trap? Their growth has been largely export-led, thanks to benign world conditions and strong global trade, which we too benefited from in India. But the Chinese really rode on it, and with possibilities of more and more closing of borders, of being more self-sufficient in quotes across the world, and the possibility that China may fall into the standard middle income trap, as an economist will say. Are they going to see robust growth over the years, or are they going to slow down? And what implications does that have? And that's something which you can discuss with Jaidev over drink and dinner, saying that if their economy goes below a 5% growth rate, what would happen? We know in India, when that happens or when inflation shoots up, we have problems, but in a democracy, there are enough safety valves. What happens in a place like China? And adding to that is the comment made so rightly about the fact of what happens when there's a tightening of grip. What does it indicate? And I think it was Ambassador Gokhale who pointed this out. I must say completely tongue-in-cheek and facetiously, I must stress that I wasn't sure whether he's talking of 1975 or today, Vijay, when you said huge majority, government, strong leader. But yes, I think the recollection of 1975 is a fair indication that just maybe, and again a thought for Jaidev, and he's addressed it in some ways here, is he really in the kind of control that he's assumed to be? He's all powerful now, yes, but does this tightening of a grip indicate some concern, some worries, or is it just paranoia? Or is he just strengthening himself for the next 10 years? Who knows? Something up there which we need to look. United Front, again mentioned by Vijay, if I recall correctly, and I don't know, or experts would have read it, but Hartcher's book on Australia is really revealing of what they're doing in Australia, mainly through money power, but through other means, and what they tried to do, I would say. So lots of lessons there for us. Lots of other lessons for us about the Chinese successes. And again, I want to stress that from my point of view, that while we slam them, very rightly, while we say they are different, they are a dictatorship, we are not, I think we can yet learn a lot from them, most of all in how they have driven technology, where they are undoubtedly, I think the Americans to admit so, today, if not among the world's top 2, in many places number 1, in areas like artificial intelligence, hypersonic vehicles, maybe even in cybersecurity. We don't really know, but they clearly have the kind of talent base which is built up, which is huge and which needs to worry us a great deal. Every time there's an outage, as there was again for the 2nd or 3rd time, I think in Maharashtra again recently, when there's a 6-hour power outage and then comes back, everybody says, oh, the power was out, it came back. What caused it? And last time round, I know it was very clear that there was a Trojan, and we don't know whether these are merely test runs or trial runs for what might be worse. So we need to worry about those areas in which the Chinese are ahead and learn from them how did they do it? How did they build from that base and get where they are? Yes, they are 5 times the economy we are. We can't afford the kind of money investments they can, but we are clever people, as we keep showing. We are innovative, we are able to do things frugally, we have enough talent, and in certain areas we are very good. So how do we take that ahead? I think this is one of the questions that we must have. And just final 2 comments. One is, and Siddharth partly in response to the question you asked, 2 big powerful neighbors living together in peace. How many instances, for how long, what period, and you can debate this historically and see, yeah, it's happened here, here, and here. But also keep in mind that it's a very difficult situation. And again, left undiscussed between Russia and China, with Russia small economically and not growing, but yet a very powerful military power. What is going to happen? The Russians withdrew from Afghanistan. Guess who's there now? For whatever reasons. It's not the Americans, it's not us. We are there in a more benign way and a more friendly way, but it's the Chinese. So what's going to happen in Central Asia, which is the backyard, which Ambassador Gokhale said is no longer a right term to use in today's globalized world. But in the backyard, where this time around the Russians played a role in Central Asia a couple of months ago, what happens when the Chinese get more assertive? And is that going to create problems between two big and powerful neighbors there? And what are the lessons for us as we hopefully emulate a peaceful rise which China used for 30 years and become more and more powerful over the years? Final comment, which before I want to wind up this, is, at the end of the day, again, Russia, China, India, China, does geography trump ideology? Yes, both communist parties, both in many ways the two present leaders coming closer to each other, both going back to deep communist roots in their families, not just themselves. What does it mean? Will it mean that the ideologies are similar, or will geography, the fact that you share borders and share backyards, become a point of conflict? And then, as we share a border, a huge, huge border with a neighbor, what happens to us between ideology and geography? So just those comments. I want to thank first our panelists for a really excellent and stimulating discussion, giving rise to a lot of things to think about, take home, digest, and discuss much more. And I want to thank all of you for being good listeners, some good questions, and thank you for your indulgence, most of all, in allowing me to overrun the time. With that, back again to whoever's closing, please.
Thank you everyone for coming today, and a special thanks to our stellar panel and our chairperson for making this event a success. Let me end today's panel discussion by saying that I wish Mr. Ranade keeps writing, we keep learning and understanding our neighbor, and the partnership between CCS and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung office in New Delhi remains, so that we can have many more successful events like today in the coming future. Thank you everyone. Please enjoy dinner and drinks. Thank you.